Okay, so in a way my talk complements Natalie's to some degree. While Natalie's looking at mainly novice teachers post-CELTA, mine's looking at the impact of CELTA on experienced teachers. Everyone at the back in here can't they? Just give me a note. Yeah, great. Okay, so before I go on to that, a little bit about me. My name is Jason Anderson. I work both in pre-service and in-service teacher education. I've got about 22 years experience of teaching and teacher training, and I've had the privilege of working both in what we might call low-income contexts in Africa and Bangladesh and other parts of the world, and also in middle and high-income countries as well. And I'm drawing on my experience in primary, secondary, tertiary and adult education, teacher education as well when I give this talk. So yeah, we're going to start with a bit of a quiz. Those of you who are CELTA trainers, as we know, there's plenty of you in the room, will probably know that the CELTA syllabus starts with the following sentence. The CELTA is an introductory course for candidates who have little or no previous English language teaching experience. So first question, just shout out your answers. Oops. What percentage? Did you see that? Oh. Okay, I'm going to put that up. So my 2016 research, I extrapolated from that small sample size, just 79. But we're looking at about 50% of CELTA trainees today have significant teaching experience, not just a taster, a few months, but a year's experience or more. The next one, what percentage self-identify as non-native speakers of English? Any guesses? 45, someone said. Okay, so David Sharno's talk at the CETA conference last year, he said for 2016 there was 48%. Can you see the green, by the way? That's kind of meant to be highlighting, and it might be working against me, mightn't it? Now, David works for Cambridge, so this is the feedback from the questionnaires that trainees complete. So it's probably quite robust, very large sample sizes. He also gave us the figures for 2005 and 2014. So I plotted them on a graph. And you can see a very strong trend line there. So if we extrapolate to 2018, this should be the first year where the number of people who self-identify as non-native speakers of English is more than the percentage of people who consider themselves native speakers on CELTA. Okay, so this is quite an interesting and significant finding. And why have I got these two figures up here? Because there's an important relationship between them. Experienced CELTA trainers will know that non-native speakers are likely to have prior teaching experience. Any guesses how many times more likely is such a person to have prior teaching experience than a native speaker?
3 times.
3 times, extremely. Well, I did a bit of a logistic regression analysis. I came up with 8 times. My confidence interval is quite large there, but it's very unlikely to be anywhere beyond 5 to 12. So it's going to be somewhere between 5 and 12 times more likely. So there is a very important relationship between these two factors. Hopefully this is compelling evidence that the key demographic on CELTA courses is changing. And we as trainers obviously need to react to that. But then again, some of us think, so what? Let's just keep going, doing the same course we've been doing for years. While the number of experienced teachers creeps up, the number of non-native speaker teachers creep up, like these 2 trainers on a Thursday night in week 3, on the way to the pub after a difficult feedback. That's me in the background, by the way. This is a quote from a very experienced CELTA trainer who did a workshop at the CETA conference last year, and she asked them who's still using the timetable they were trained up on. Almost everyone raised their hands. And she also asked them, when you travel overseas in what we call sometimes itinerant CELTA training, where you travel to a different country, to what extent do you change the course that you use? And many of them said, I don't adapt it at all. So they're using the same course, basically, which is used for pre-service teacher education in the UK with inexperienced native speakers when they're working in countries where they're not familiar with the context, not familiar with the students. They're using exactly the same course designed for pre-service teacher education for in-service teacher development. And that doesn't apply to all trainers. I can see some experienced CELTA trainers in the room who know their context very well and work overseas. But even for those people, you often don't work in the same classroom as that teacher, and we have to be very, very aware of the fact that the CELTA now is becoming almost 2 key different things in 2 key situations. So at the end of the talk, I'd like to give some recommendations based on about 4 years of research of looking at the career paths and the challenges that non-native speakers face on CELTAs and what happens after. But first I'd like to report on, very briefly on my 2 prior studies and then on my most recent study, I'd like to just provide a little bit of evidence that we need to make these changes, and then I'll go on to the recommendations at the end. Okay, so my 2016 study, which Natalie, I think, mentioned, it was referring to that one, in ELT Journal. The first question I wanted to ask was, are there differences? And we can see here, prior experience, the dark bar is non-native speakers. Again, it was self-identified as non-native speakers, and the pale bar, native speakers. And then with regard to prior qualifications, we can see the non-native speakers, about 50% have a longer country-specific qualification, like in the UK, you might do a PGCE. Many of them will have that kind of qualification. And there were lots of other differences as well, but we can also see that the needs of these participants was significantly different, and I found that the outcome in terms of how satisfied they were with the course was also different. But the difference there was quite small, and all respondents were generally reporting fairly high levels of satisfaction. So then I wanted to understand a bit more about the role the CELTA plays in their development as teachers. And I also wanted to kind of ask that key question, why are experienced teachers taking a course designed for pre-service teacher education? And many of you can probably guess the answer. These are some of the kind of findings of that study. It's just being published in IATEFL now. You can find it online, and that as a kind of advanced access, but it will be coming soon. I suppose the most important thing I took away from this was to ask the question, why are they doing this course? And the participants in this study were reporting two things. One thing not surprising, as Natalie's study was mentioning, mobility. There are many teachers who want to travel and work overseas. It isn't just native speaker teachers of English. And the second one, perhaps the most important one, was parity. They wanted a qualification to say, this proves that I'm as good as any native speaker teacher. And that is why a course like the ICELT, which is designed, or comes from a design which was initially created for other contexts, why that course isn't the course that so many of them are choosing, despite Cambridge's best efforts to try to get some of them to choose the ICELT course. Cool. And what was interesting for me was that many of them mentioned that they were finding the iterative cycle of TP, feedback, planning, TP, feedback, planning, and this kind of praxis relationship between the inputs and the TP, they were finding it really useful. And so therefore I wanted to do a bit more research onto exactly what was happening and what impact it was happening on their practices. So I was invited to Egypt to work on 2 CELTAs in 2016, an opportunity I jumped at. And this was the context in which I did the current study that I'm reporting on. You can see that nearly all of the teachers on the course were experienced, all but were Arabic speakers. One of them was bilingual, native speaker as well. And they're all working mainly in Egypt and Saudi Arabia, mainly at secondary level, but across the Gulf as well, there were other places. And nearly all were self-funded. And for an Egyptian teacher, the cost of a CELTA is 1 year's salary, approximately. So put that in perspective, how much is your salary? For me, that would be 30 to 40 grand for a 4-week course. This is a high-stakes course for many of these participants. And that is why these courses, and many trainers who work internationally will know, can be quite intense experiences. I was working with very experienced co-tutors, both local experienced tutors and 2 other tutors who are CELTA assessors. And we felt that we were able to as well as we could, to tailor the course to the needs of these participants. And we made significant amounts of adaptations as a result. And you can see from the grades there, they're well above the average for CELTAs. These were capable, effective teachers. My research questions, the basic question I wanted to answer was, what impact is it having on their practice 6 months down the line? To what extent are they finding the need to adapt what they're learning on the course to their current context? In Natalie's study, she mentioned the fact that some of her participants were also finding a need to kind of develop more context-specific practices. And the methodology, unfortunately, I was only able to use self-reported data. It was very difficult to get into the classroom or even to get videos of the classroom, which I tried, but this is self-reported data. So as a result, I'm focusing on the narratives, the perceptions, attitudes, and beliefs, and not presuming that this is evidence of actual impact. But you can see I did a kind of a quantitative, qualitative study, maximum variation sampling with the participants, and then some Skype interviews with 8 participants. And then, in a nutshell, the key findings. Most of them had felt, were expressing a commitment to implement what they learned on the course. This wasn't just for my career development, to improve, to get a different job. They were finding that they wanted to implement what they'd learned on the course. There seemed to be a shift in belief on the part of most towards more learner-centered communicative practices. And in the paper that I've that I've got in review at the moment for this, I go into more detail what I mean by communicative learner-centred. And there were reported increases in self-confidence from several participants, including even in relation to getting new jobs as a result of the course. But, and this is the key point, CELTA practices and conventions need significant adaptation and critical appropriation to work in the context in which these teachers were working. Not surprising to many of you, I'm sure. And what was interesting for me was some of the highest scoring candidates on the course in terms of those getting A and B grades were the ones reporting the largest amount of adaptation and appropriation rather than simply implementation. This is an interesting graphic, and it shows the number of respondents who discussed these issues. And the dark is discussed as a positive change and the pale as something they had difficulty with. Can you see the pale colour there? Is it coming through? For some of you it is. Again, this is all online. You can access it there now if you go to my website. Now, one thing that you can see is that there's much more blue than there is, dark blue than there is pale blue. That could be taken as an indication that many of these respondents were very, very happy with the course and they were implementing it lots. But bear in mind that I was their prior tutor. And so a lot of them were possibly reporting what they wanted me to hear. So comparing that, the dark blue to the light blue may be dangerous. Comparing the dark blue itself, I think, is interesting because they're talking about the balance of what they're finding most easiest to, which things they're talking about most as things which they're able to implement and which things they're talking about less. And then comparing the pale blue as well. And I'll come on to those now. So the most commonly discussed areas of success were the importance of allowing free practice opportunities, and you can see a quote there. A stronger focus on the needs and interests of their learners, that they were starting to think about putting themselves in the learners' perspectives and trying to understand that. Several felt better able to structure their lessons more effectively. They were finding things like the PPP, task-based learning, TTT, and my CAP, one, if you know. They were finding these quite useful as a way of bringing it together. One of the respondents said that she had lots of prior training, but she felt that this was a way of helping her to structure the lessons, the teaching that she was doing. Several respondents, as I mentioned before, an increase in self-confidence, and some success with parent group work. But this was also the area most mentioned when I was asking to what extent are you needing to change your practices. My questions, by the way, were very open. I was letting them lead the discussion and only prompting if and when necessary with respondents. So collaborative learning, many of the respondents found this really, really challenging, especially with team classes, especially with exam classes. One of the respondents, a really, really good trainee on the course, found that group work was almost impossible, but the pair work seemed to work quite well, and he discussed the situation in which he was getting them to peer scaffold the development of speaking skills. Free practice as well was closely related. Obviously, you can have one without the other, but these two things are very closely related, and this was a term that many of them were using because it's one of those terms that tends to be used on the CELTA. So we got them talking about learners sometimes resorting to L1 or going off track. Motivational issues, because so many of these students, Egypt is a context where there are high-stakes exams, and of course, as you can guess, they don't have any speaking element in them. So often they were seeing the speaking element as being less relevant, and one respondent was mentioning that I was able to improve, for example, reading and writing skills by using some of the methodology on the CELTA, but with texts based around the exam, that kind of adaptation. And then learning culture. Differences between countries in terms of how students expect to learn and teachers are expected to teach, and this was an important factor as well. This last comment was a teacher who worked with adult learners, small classes, private language school, the ideal environment some of us might think for a CELTA type approach. And she was finding that many of the groups wanted to present their role plays at the end of the lesson for the rest of the class, and this was an important part of the lesson for them. For me, I tend to find that kills off my classes in the UK when they're all presenting it, but for her and for her students, this was something important, something she found she had to do. Okay, so I'm now going to move on to some recommendations, and these recommendations are based on the 4 years of research. The 2 studies I did where I was looking specifically at non-native speakers, and the 1 study I did, this most recent one, looking at them as experienced teachers, but we were essentially talking about the same group of people. The first point is to adapt more developmental approaches to teaching practice. I can see Donald at the back there, including his alternatives approach. Donald, in his very early paper, mentions that there are different ways of doing feedback after teaching practice. A lot of CELTA tutors tend to adopt what he would call a supervisory approach. And one simple alternative, because CELTA isn't necessarily prescriptive, you have to meet the criteria or you don't get the qualification. We can still go beyond the supervisory approach. And the alternatives approach is where you allow the teacher to explore a different way of doing it and to consider the degree to which they're able to, they want to, and to experiment with a different idea. And it can and does, I think personally, fit well within the constraints of the CELTA course. The second one, for me, this is perhaps the most important, to provide opportunities for critical discussion of how they will appropriate from what they've learned rather than implement it. And there are two places where I believe this is really important. Number one, an input in week 4. We had a lot of success doing a roundtable discussion with the participants where we said, okay, so we're doing well under CELTA, but when you go back to your classes, to what extent are you going to be able to implement this in very different contexts to the context you've been teaching on here? And that encouraged them to open up and to discuss it really well. CELTA trainers will know there's an assignment on the course called Lessons from the Classroom, which we typically do in week 4. And in that assignment, one of the requirements is for teachers to reflect on how they might develop their skills and knowledge after the course. Now, for an experienced teacher, that kind of doesn't really fit to who they are, where they're going back to. And so adapting that so they can reflect also on how they will critically appropriate and to some extent implement what they're learning on the course is for me a much more valid thing to do in that assignment. And they find it useful as well. It links well to that input session. The third point there, it's really, really important, even if you personally don't agree with the notion of English as lingua franca and you're not an advocate of it, it's really, really important as tutors that we make sure that we allow our participants on our courses to be aware that this is a key discourse that's happening in ELT. I personally am a big advocate of it, and I think it can empower non-native speaker teachers to realise they don't have to listen to and to assume native speaker norms when they use grammar, pronunciation, and so on in the classroom. Related to that, but separate, an input session on using L1 effectively in the classroom I think is really, really important. If you're working in a context where some of the teachers do speak the same first language as their learners, they can experiment with it in the classroom. And those of you who are at the CETA conference will know that in point 5.3 of the CELTA syllabus, in the very near future, this is from David Shano's talk, that we will be able to give them credit for using their own English language skills and L1 where appropriate to enhance the effectiveness of their teaching. So that's actually something that's coming through in the CELTA syllabus, and we will be able to give credit for. And that for me is really, really important to be able to do that. We can use experienced NNESTs, non-native English speaker teachers, on a CELTA course as resources. Many of you CELTA tutors will know that when they're sitting through a grammar input, they're not learning anything, they know this. They already have a lot of skills in terms of lesson planning, a lot of proceduralized knowledge, and we can use that as an asset on the course. Many of us do. If you're working in the UK and you've got, say, 5 non-native experienced teachers, putting them in different TP groups will obviously enhance the amount of dialogue and understanding within that TP group. But using them as a resource rather than fighting against their prior knowledge or seeing them as somebody who knows it all is a really, really important thing to do. So even getting them to do grammar inputs is possible, and it's worked effectively for me on such courses. And then raise awareness of all course participants of discrimination towards NNESTs in the industry and encourage them to actively oppose it. So Marek Kiszkowiak, Karen Krumenacker, who frustratingly is talking in a different room at this very moment, and Daniel Baines wrote this paper for ELTED 2016 where they encourage this. And it's really important for all participants, in my opinion, to do this. When someone comes off a CELTA course, they're looking for a job, and many can accept those advertisements for native speaker wanted in certain countries. And being aware that that's the kind of practice that we are trying as an industry to outlaw and to make, to move away from this idea of advertising for native speakers as something both to sell to school and within the teacher development, the school's actual teacher recruitment policy is not a good thing. And that paper provides some interesting suggestions as to how we can do it on the course, and they did an input on that. And then finally, the final point isn't so much based on my research, but based on my own personal experience as a tutor. It's something I feel quite strongly, and some of you may disagree with me about this, but my final point is, remember that when you're working with experienced teachers as a CELTA tutor, especially if you haven't worked with experienced teachers much, your job is not to show or tell them how to teach. Your mandate is only to help them to get the qualification. That's what they've paid you for. That's what they want you to do. That's what you can guarantee you can help them with. You can't guarantee that you know about how to teach in their classroom, even if you're experienced in a very similar context, because you're not doing the training in their classroom, which is where most in-service teacher development happens, and a lot of research is saying the most effective teacher development should be happening. Now, by explaining that at the start of the course, that our aim as your tutors is never to criticise you or your practice, it's to help you meet the criteria to get this qualification, can help to reduce that effective barrier, so that they don't see that they're working in opposition to you every time you mention something that you think they should change in their TP lessons. That I'm not mentioning that because I believe you should change it as a teacher, but that this will help you to meet the criteria, and then after that, what you take back to your classroom, that's for your critical appropriation. That can help them to recognise that, okay, we are working together to the same aim. And I know of many CELTA tutors who work with non-native speakers, and they find it a battle because of this relationship and because of the fact that the non-native speaker teachers feels you're criticising me, you're criticising who I am and who I've been for 20 years as a teacher or whatever, 5 or 7. So that's my last kind of piece of advice, and that's a personal piece of advice as a trainer. If you are working with large numbers of non-native speakers, that can really help, I think, to create a more appropriate environment for movement towards a very criteria-specified qualification. Cool. So, find out more. The paper that I've got in review is just hobbling its way through the review process with innovation in language learning and teaching. I've called it Buying into Communicative Language Teaching because there is a very strong sense in which these people are making a financial and personal investment in a qualification that will then get them into a community of practice. And I'm looking at it from that perspective. There is much more thick data in terms of the description of the narratives. You'll find much more on issues to do with discrimination in there and to do with the challenges they faced in the classroom. And the slides and references are here, and you can see the references zooming down there as well. There's a summary of this talk on my blog, hopefully now on speaking games, as I call it. And perhaps the most important thing I would say is try something with your own trainees. We need more evidence from direct observation. So it's not that difficult to talk to your trainees 6 months after a course. Learning from that is really useful. It doesn't have to be formal. And in the classroom as well, I know Kadir Öztürk from Turkey is doing some longitudinal research in the classroom of experienced teachers. And we hope that we're going to get more, because this is just the start of research into something that is changing significantly. Whether we do or don't like it, it seems that CELTA courses are being more and more delivered to experienced non-native speaker teachers, and we need to make sure that as trainers, we are as much as possible adapting the course to meet their needs. Cool. I think that's it. Thank you very much. 1 minute for question. Okay. Yes, Bill. Keith, you come up and then you get yourself ready, and then do you want to use my time? And then Bill gets.
I was just going to say, to contradict what the advice that you just said about, I'm just going to help you to get a certificate. I've just been working on the CELTA with Iranian teachers, and I asked them, are you coming for the training process or the qualification? And obviously they wanted both, but hopefully they got much more out of the training than they did getting the paper. So I didn't say what you said. I said, hopefully you're going to be the best teacher you can within 4 weeks, and at the end you'll get the grade that you deserve. So I didn't have that.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's a different way of doing it. And I did say you may not agree with it. My response to that would be, maybe there's teachers who are already great teachers. And how do you
They were already.
I know that's a really obvious point, but that's kind of a back challenge, if you know what I mean. So who are you and I, as people who come from one country to other countries, to know how to teach in the